And this is DawgNation Daily, the daily pod week for Christmas. So I hope all of you get a chance to enjoy Monday for that. Then in New Orleans, Tuesday of Thursday. So we're busy the following week with the bowl game. And obviously, Jeff, at least until after Christmas. So we're going to try to make it a good one. A lot of recruiting stuff. That includes Jeff Sintel, also of the Sugar Bowl. How does all of that kind of impact what is going to say about that? And as I said before, Jeff Sintel begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Kroger. Fresh for everyone.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
There's going to kind of be busy time signing period, but for the most part, Georgia's news on that won't come until early January or maybe a couple more guys comes. Well, what is next on the horizon for Georgia? Now, a lot of trying to get involved with others. We'll do that with Jeff Sintel. But let me deal with another about the conversation for 2020 for the Dogs on the field. Everything centers around this issue now, but one way or another, this is the issue that will, I think, said I'm going to be a part of that. Now, Kirby Smart, when he spoke to reporters on Wednesday from Athens as a part of his, did kind of address that issue of how much do you know about Jake Fromm and what's the process after his junior season? Or if he's going to be back to say about that on the subject of Jake Fromm and him coming back. Here is what Kirby had to say about Jake Fromm. Let's listen to this.
As far as Jake, we do with Jake exactly what we do with every player on our team. We bring them in. We talk to teams. I talk to general managers. I talk to organizations. We get information. We give those kids that information. This is a time when they're able to do that. And then when we get closer to the bowl game, we put it away, and then we come back and revisit it. And we've done those things with Jake.
So here's my opinion on Jake Fromm. I think it's more likely than not Jake probably plays at Georgia next season. I think it's just, if we're talking about like a pie chart of possibilities, the biggest slice of that pie is that Fromm comes back for his senior year and he attempts to make a big name for himself to be a part of the 2021 draft. If I had to guess, I think that's the more likely scenario overall. However, it is not a foregone conclusion to me that Fromm is indeed coming back. I do think he's going through some deliberations right now. And I think that Fromm is probably leaning on what Kirby Smart hears from some of those NFL sources, the way that Smart described. I think that Fromm's probably also leaning on some other sources as well. Obviously, his parents will be influential in this discussion. They're probably reaching out to their own contacts and making their own contacts so they can help make that decision. Here's the one thing that I think that we've all kind of come to understand, even though we don't spend a ton of time talking about the NFL draft on this show. We're a college football-oriented show here on DawgNation Daily presented by Kroger, but the NFL draft can be really difficult to predict because, as Connor Riley said yesterday as a part of our RS Andrews Cooldown, the video comment section that we do, it only takes one team to draft you, right? Whether it be a first-round pick or a second-round pick, you can have 31 NFL teams saying one thing, but if one of those 32 teams feels differently, then that changes the entire equation. Think back to Tim Tebow when he entered the NFL draft. There are a lot of teams saying, we don't view Tebow as a first-round quarterback, but the Denver Broncos felt differently, and that's all it took was just that one team to feel differently. So when it comes to making a prediction about Fromm, it's not easy to do, even though you would say, well, the numbers this year weren't quite what I expected them to be, therefore he has to come back. Not necessarily. NFL teams make their evaluations on their, based on their own criteria, and that's not always statistics in college games that they use most prominently for something like that. It's not necessarily a given that just because the stats for Fromm underwhelmed this year that he's necessarily coming back. He might, but I think we're going to have to wait and find this out one way or another about what Jake Fromm's status is. And obviously what Fromm ends up doing one way or another will determine what Georgia also does with the rest of its roster. Maybe potentially adding another quarterback. Seemingly it tried to add one on Wednesday as part of the early signing period when it certainly made some strong overtures to C.J. Stroud. Stroud ultimately chose Ohio State over Georgia. He ended up being a part of the Buckeyes 2020 class. But the notion of still adding another quarterback, whether it be from recruiting or maybe most likely in a transfer sense, that's the kind of thing that Kirby Smart said that Georgia is still very much open to. Here's what Smart had to say about that.
We're looking for all positions. We got some spots left, and we're looking at every position out there to sign best available players. And that signing a second quarterback's not out of the question, but it's not necessarily something we have to do.
So listen, let me try to sort of sum all of this up all together. I think it's interesting that Smart spoke about Fromm on Wednesday. Obviously, that question becomes a very difficult one to answer. But while I can't tell you for sure if Georgia's going to have Jake Fromm as the starting quarterback or not, we don't know that as of yet. Here's the one thing I do know for sure, and at least I can say with some certainty. one way or another, Georgia's still going to have a capable starting quarterback in 2020. And if it's Jake Fromm, don't be so quick to assume that Fromm won't take a major step forward in his senior season. Make the comparison to Joe Burrow here for a moment, who really used a seasoned level of experience to flourish in the Joe Brady offense was brought together there at LSU this season. We've said before, Burrow is older than at least a couple of starting quarterbacks in the NFL right now, namely guys like Lamar Jackson and Sam Darnold, guys that you see on Sundays. Burrow's actually older than those guys right now, and he used that experience, that aged, that kind of seasoned veteran status to the tune of a Heisman Trophy campaign here in the 2019 season. If Jake Fromm comes back for 2020, I'm not going to tell you he's going to have the same eye-popping numbers that Joe Burrow did, but having great success because of how many times he's been around the block now, that's a very strong possibility. Or if Fromm says, you know what, I'm going to strike while the iron's hot. I've got teams telling me that they're interested in drafting me. I'm going to move on to the NFL and start my professional career. I don't think the Georgia program just falls apart without Jake Fromm. I think the Kirby Smart will be looking to, if I had to assume, more likely than not, add a transfer quarterback as opposed to another quarterback in the 2020 class here at this point in time. But there are potentially big names available in that role if that's where Georgia chooses to go down. We've obviously talked about Derek King, the former Houston quarterback. Now there's KJ Costello, the former Stanford quarterback. Or maybe there are other names, guys that we haven't considered yet, guys who haven't put their status out there as of yet. One way or another, though, no matter how much the Georgia offense might have struggled this season, and no matter how true it is that Georgia ultimately finished short of its ultimate goal of being back in the college football playoff, winning the national championship, if Fromm does depart, the Georgia starting quarterback position will be a very, very attractive thing. And whether it be a guy like Carson Beck or Dwan Mathis competing and winning that job in a competition, or a newcomer coming in and getting a chance to do what other transfer quarterbacks have done for college football playoff teams this year, Georgia will still be a very big part of the conversation. So we can't answer all the questions right now. We don't know if Jake Fromm's coming back, and if he does leave, we don't know who Georgia's starting quarterback is going to be. But while we can't provide those answers now, that doesn't mean those answers don't exist. And one of the fun things about 2020 is finding out all of this, exactly where the Georgia offense is going to go, and exactly which quarterback is going to be the one to lead it. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Hello to you, and thanks for being with us. Well, no matter how you get to us today, live on video, 10 a.m., DawgNation Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. We're on the radio at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and we are available as a podcast wherever you find them, including the world-famous DawgNation.com. Looking forward to actually being back on the radio again today, by the way, after being preempted the last couple of days. We're happy to be back on the Classic City again today, and, of course, we appreciate Kroger for making it all possible here today, and, of course, as we head towards that Christmas holiday next week and this holiday season we've been enjoying now for the last couple of weeks, you can get a a lot of savings with our friends at Kroger, but you've got to opt in to do so. It's 12 Days of Merry, courtesy of Kroger, so text 12MERRY. That's 12, Merry like Merry Christmas. Text 12MERRY to 99894, and you can start saving today during 12 Days of Merry from our friends at Kroger. It'll be Jeff Sintel here coming up in just a moment. We'll talk some recruiting with him. There are still some unfinished business for Georgia when it comes to the rest of the 2020 class, so we'll let Jeff fill us in on the details on that. Some rumors that are out there, some fun stuff, big names yet to come. Good conversation here coming up with Jeff Sintel in just a minute. Before that, though, Around the DawgHouse, presented today by Merriweather and Tharp, and I want to keep that theme going that I said off the top of the program. I said today, in large measure, is going to be about what's next, and one of the big what's next questions for Georgia is, well, who is the starting quarterback for 2020? Once the Sugar Bowl's done, is Jake Fromm done? Is he going to the NFL, or is Georgia going to add someone in there, or is Fromm coming back to have a triumphant conclusion to his Georgia career? That's one of the what's next questions, and one of the other what's next questions for Georgia that's still out there is, well, what's going to happen with this Georgia offense? Is it going to be a carbon copy of what it was this year with James Coley leading it and some of the same, let's face it, kind of results? Georgia fans weren't happy with those results all the way around. There have been a lot of rumors about that. There was a report in The Athletic a few days ago that Georgia had reached out to Mike Bobo, obviously a former Georgia offensive coordinator, former Georgia quarterback, most recently Colorado State head coach, that Andy Staples had reported that Kirby had tried to hire Mike Bobo. I talked to him about a job there at Georgia. Obviously, that would seem to make sense, just given the fact that the Georgia offense this season left a lot to be desired. But also, to hear that about Bobo kind of contradicts pretty much everything else that Kirby has said about this publicly, where he has never really led on that he was all that dissatisfied with the way the offense was running or the guy that was calling those plays in James Coley. Kirby obviously not happy with the results, but not all that critical of the process. So a little bit of confusion of, did Kirby really try to hire Mike Bobo? And what exactly is Kirby's viewpoint on the offense? Is he looking to make changes with that group here during the offseason? Well, Wednesday, Kirby talked about that, tried to refute the Mike Bobo stuff, tried to, speak cryptically about any changes that might come during the offseason. I talked about this with Mike Griffith yesterday, and I at least wanted you to hear the statement from Kirby that was the genesis of what we said on yesterday's program. So here is Kirby denying the Bobo stuff and leaving the door open, I guess, for some sort of change to come during the offseason. Here's Kirby on that.
I talk to Mike often and Elias. We're really good friends. But as far as conversation about coming to coach at University of Georgia, no. He and I conversed about what he was going to do when he was let go, but that was during the week of the LSU game. As far as any other changes or anything like that, that's decided, after the bowl game, after we look back at the whole year. We're working really hard right now on Baylor, on giving our kids an opportunity to play, and that's really where our focus is.
So I said this with Mike yesterday, and I'll say it with all of you again right now. I find conversations like this to be incredibly tedious, incredibly frustrating for a simple reason. A lot of where you fall on this kind of comes on how you define talk about a job, how you define job offer. Kirby Smart says, no, we didn't talk about that job. No offer was extended. But there are lots of different ways to define that and lots of ways to give yourself an out if you indeed at least attempted that and Bobo decided he'd rather go somewhere he hasn't worked before as opposed to coming back to Georgia. Maybe he feels, I won't assume why Bobo might have felt that way, but if Bobo said, maybe some new pasture that I haven't been in before is better than kind of coming back and being a part of a program I've already been a part of, if you're Kirby Smart, you can define this conversation in such a way to say, yeah, we talked, but we didn't talk about that. Or if you're on the South Carolina side of this, presumably I don't think that Bobo would try to float this to make Georgia look bad, but much the same way that Tennessee loved the idea of flexing last year to say, hey, we took Georgia's offensive coordinator. What was it that Niedermeyer, the tight ends coach, said? Big bank takes little bank. We didn't necessarily see that way here in the state of Georgia, certainly here on DawgNation Daily, but they love the idea of pitching it as big bad Tennessee took Jim Chaney away from Georgia. Someone at South Carolina certainly would probably like the idea of, hey, it was an arms race for Mike Bobo, and South Carolina won it. Muschamp beat out Kirby for this big-time offensive mind. Obviously, South Carolina folks would have a motivation to kind of plant that story in the media, and really both sides here have a motivation there in that regard. So it's very, very difficult to know what really is going on, how much Kirby Smart really wants to make offensive changes, and how much he would have viewed Mike Bobo as the kind of guy that could potentially bring them. But the one thing I think is also certain on this is that Kirby's popularity, as big as it is, and he is a very, very popular coach here around Georgia, one way or another, I think he is putting that popularity at risk moving forward. Either the offense changes and gets better or it doesn't. But one way or another, if it's the same kind of thing next year, when you're asking Kirby questions about this isn't so much, hey, Kirby, as the big, powerful, popular head coach of Georgia, what are you going to do to fix this one part of the program that isn't working? That's not the way those questions will be framed to him next year. If the offense doesn't get better in 2020, whether it's Coley still calling the plays or someone else or anything along those lines, at that point in time, it becomes more of a question about Kirby Smart and what's wrong with him that the offense can't get better, as opposed to what it is now. Hey, Kirby, what are you going to do to fix it? So this is one of those things where I think Kirby's got a lot at stake in terms of how he either maintains the status quo or moves forward with something different. But that's another one of those major, major questions at stake for Georgia as the offseason begins, as soon as the calendar year begins after the Sugar Bowl on January the 1st. It's Around the DawgHouse. It's presented today by Merriweather and Tharp. And let's face it, if this time of year you find yourself on the doorstep of a divorce conversation, that's not something that you want to have. I certainly understand that, and obviously our prayers are with you as you kind of go through that here during this time. I know some of the most prominent feelings you may have right now, kind of a scary and confusing feeling, and there are a lot of questions that it's not an easy thing for you to answer. I totally appreciate that. But the one thing you should understand is, while this may be the first time you're going through this, my friends at Merriweather and Tharp have been through these types of things thousands of times, and there is institutional knowledge gained when you go through this as much as Merriweather and Tharp has. And so if you find yourself facing this situation right now, you need an advocate on your side. That's why you want to trust Merriweather Meriwether and Tharp, their Atlanta divorce team, offices all throughout the Atlanta area. They are your source for Georgia divorce. So find them online at theatlantadivorceteam.com. That's theatlantadivorceteam.com. And they can really set you up for a much better conclusion, a happier ending to your story than you may think possible right now. Meriwether and Tharp can provide that. So find them online at theatlantadivorceteam.com. It's great to have you with us here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. I'm going to play a request later on. We were asked to talk more about the phenomenal feat that Jermaine Burton once did back late spring, early summer, the most recent UGA signee. We'll have some fun with that later on today here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. But for now, big question still out there about what's left to be done for Georgia with its 2020 class. Let's talk about that with our buddy Jeff Sintel here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
As Jeff Sintel joins us, I will also remind you really quickly here that this is our last show for a week. We are going to take the Christmas week off next week, so no podcast, no radio, no video for us next week. So we appreciate you allowing us to spend some time with our families and friends, and we hope that you all get a chance to do that same thing. But we also want to make sure we finish on a strong note here today. So before our vacation next week, let's do it hard right now with Jeff Sintel here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. And Jeff, let me bring you into the conversation this way. I said off the top of the program that kind of one of our themes today is what's next. After a busy lead up to the SEC championship game and then a quick transition to the start of the early signing period, maybe now it's a catch your breath type moment of what are the big storylines about to be for Georgia, both leading into the Sugar Bowl and beyond. And obviously a lot of that does center around recruiting. There are a few names that are kind of still out there for Georgia, some maybe more of a legit connection than others, and that's kind of what I want to talk to you about right now. Let me begin with this. You made it pretty clear on the forum the other day at forum.dawgnation.com that even despite the fact that five-star defensive lineman Jordan Burch has not signed his letter of intent to South Carolina, you think, at least seemingly, if I'm reading you correctly, that's a formality that he ends up with the Gamecocks. If that is the case, my question for you is a simple one. Do you think that Georgia is still recruiting Burch right now?
Hey, Brandon. Good morning, everybody. Hey, let's just come out of the box swinging, okay? Zachary Evans, Jordan Burch, I know that's what everybody wants to talk about. Those are the last 5 stars that could sprinkle into the Georgia class. Now, listen, I understand why people are pumping that narrative. I understand why coaches are still getting paid to recruit, and they're still going to think about Jordan Burch. They're still going to recruit Jordan Burch. We put in the forum that, the reason why that letter's not in, the reason why the letter won't be in is because the Hammond School, all those guys signed as a class. Even Alex Huntley, who committed to Georgia committed to South Carolina way back in the summer. He committed to South Carolina. He's going to sign with South Carolina, but that letter will not be in until February. Just the way the Hammond School does things. I think it's just not reality. I mean, folks are going to look there. They're going to see that the body language of Jordan Burch and his family when he made that decision from Columbia, that maybe why he didn't exude joy in his ESPN Live announcement. Sure, that doesn't seem like he's happy and everything is done and he can't wait to be a Gamecock. But I just got to look at this thing and say Jordan Burch has had ample opportunities to choose Georgia. He's been there so many times. He was on his official visit that certainly left a lot of folks thinking that he was going to be a Bulldog. Yet, remember, he didn't have to sign during the early period. He's going to go his entire senior year at Hammond School. He didn't have to decide during the early period. He didn't have to move his decision day up from one day to another because he was so certain of where he wanted to go. But you can't, in a business like this, when there's no information about Jordan Burch, and the information that comes out of his circle is so tight, that you just got to look at what the young man does. You got to look at the deeds. Even the visits matter, but the deeds matter. I mean, he had an ample opportunity to choose Georgia, and he didn't. So, and we don't even know, quite frankly, Brandon, and anybody that says otherwise, they're just guessing or taking information from second and third-hand sources. We don't even know where Georgia was in his pecking order. We don't know if Clemson was third. We don't know if Georgia was third. We don't even know if LSU was second.
Sure.
So I think with Jordan Burch, you just got to be real and say, yeah, the glimmers are still there, the hopes are still there, the possibility is still there. Everybody's going to keep those Columbia fires burning. But the reality here is this young man had his chance to choose Georgia. He didn't have to choose during the early signing period at all, but he made his decision to go to South Carolina. And unless extenuating circumstances change, which I feel might be, a relocation change for his family or whatever reasons that want to keep him in Columbia, you have to think that he's going to hold serve on that commitment. Now, with Zachary Evans, everybody's going to sit there and say, what's going to happen with him? He didn't make his decision known whether he signed it all during the early signing period. Is he going to still make his commitment decision at the Under Armour All-American game? Those will be very interesting questions we'll have for Zachary Evans going into the Under Armour All-American game. I'd be interested to see what he does when he meets the media during Media Day on December the 28th. But you got to remember, the information that I believe to be true is that Georgia reached a point where they were only going to take one running back in this class. So I think you've got to lump what's Zachary Evans going to do and where can Georgia get in on Zachary Evans, even with all the online chatter out there. You got to think about that and wonder, if Zachary Evans, if it's Jahmyr Gibbs, does Georgia really need to get in on a class when get on a certain position in class where, as you said before, there's still guys left on the board that we're going to talk about. I bet you got questions about. But right now, everybody wants to know about Birch. Everybody wants to know about Zachary Evans. What can still blossom out of this 2020 class?
Yeah, I do want to get more into Evans here in a moment. Let me finish off on Birch, though, before we start talking too much about any other recruit. So I totally get your perspective on this, that it's more likely than not that what we saw on TV or on our DawgNation streaming video channels on Wednesday is the end result, that Birch stays with South Carolina. It's at least fair to say, though, that behind the scenes, quietly, we'll never know a lot of this, that Georgia's still trying to alter this decision, correct?
Yes. I mean, that's just what they're paid to do. They're paid to go after and get the best players. And when Jordan Birch is off the table, that's when the letter of intent is still in. We see this all the time. When that letter of intent is not in, then coaches and recruiters and staff try to think there's still a chance to go get that player. The thing with Birch, though, is there needs to be a radical change in his situation. I said a relocation, it may be a coach moving on or whatever. But even if he wanted to play for Georgia and he felt like that was where he wanted to be, the fact that he's not choosing Georgia, I think still means a great deal. Because I think that, as you can see, and as we've tried to quietly discuss around this recruitment, that this is a different recruitment, a more managed recruitment we've ever been around.
All right, let me do something else here. You mentioned Zachary Evans. I want to get to him here in a little bit. A couple things before we get there. Obviously, Georgia fans are also kind of waiting on pins and needles for the early January announcements. Different days for both guys, but they all both come at those all-star games right at the beginning of the month between five-star cornerback Kelee Ringo, five-star tight end Darnell Washington. Now, we'll all find out, I think, soon enough about both of these guys. But is there anything that you can tell us about them here, during this early signing period ahead of what they're going to do in early January? Anything to say or report? I know you talked to both these guys recently. Anything to say or report on Ringo or Washington right now?
So, listen, Brandon, we just try to please our audience. We just try to talk about the things that are just blossoming up that people want to know about. I think it's kind of like going through the grocery store and seeing those National Enquirer lanes right there. Everybody wants to know, is that real? What's happening? Can that possibly happen? I think it's worthwhile to talk about those things. I know people want to hear about those things, but to me, the meat and potatoes left in the close of Georgia's signing day class is Darnell Washington, Cedric Von Prawn, Broderick Jones, and Kelee Ringo. That's the meat and potatoes of what's left. And folks, I don't want to break it to you. I don't think I'm breaking any news here. But I think Georgia's chances with each four of those young men are still better than Zachary Evans and still better than Jordan Birch. I think if Georgia finishes with those four names, then those are the four names that will make this class a stellar class and can even make it a number one, number two type class, depending on where Zachary Evans ends up if he goes to a certain school compared to another. Ringo has made the emoji announcement that he signed somewhere. The announcement could come on January the 2nd during the Under Armour game. The same thing goes for Kelee Ringo, January the 4th in the All-American Bowl. The other two, though, Cedric Von Prawn, you hear things about Cedric Von Prawn that thinks Georgia's still going to be in a very good spot there with Von Prawn. Broderick Jones, he shows upon this. It's Georgia and Auburn. Auburn's going to get an official. Georgia's going to get an official. That's going to be a dominant January storyline with a player that has been committed to Georgia for well over 15, 16, 18 months now. So Jones, Von Prawn, those are the February targets. I'm going to throw in the name McKinley Jackson as well. That's the 4-star defensive tackle, the number 12 defensive tackle in the country. He's a top 150 player. Very connected, knows about Matt Luke a lot. Expected to visit Georgia during January. That would be another defensive tackle for the front. This would be more of a classic nose, a gap filler, which would be more help for the defensive line that currently does not have a Jordan Burch type signature finish to the class. McKinley Jackson, named after the same as Mount McKinley in Alaska. He is also at the All-American Bowl out in Texas. He's also going to take his thing out in February. Keely Ringo, let me make sure I cover all the bases. He signed. He's happy he signed somewhere. That announcement will come January the 4th. I think it's very important to wonder about the specter of a Burch and the specter of an Evans, because those two names have always kind of felt like at some points real and in some points fool's gold in this class. I think the terra firma about what Georgia can do to nail down perhaps its most athletic and freakiest class in the Kirby Smart era would be to take care of business and get the signatures from those 4 young men. That would be Washington, Ringo, and that would be Cedric Von Prawn and Broderick Jones.
All right.
Key guys.
We got more Jeff Sintel here coming up. Before that, though, let me remind you about my friends at the Atlanta and North Georgia Building Trades Council. For anyone who does kind of like construction-type work for a living, this is a really important organization for you to know because they're dedicated to the economic stability of your career. Folks who do what you do for a living, they provide more better living wages. They protect your benefits. You can earn while you learn with no tuition apprentice training. I'm talking about as much as $100,000 while you're serving your apprenticeship. They also offer employer-paid pension and insurance. And guess what? Your wages can be up to 30% higher than non-union workers. This is also not just for men. Women and everyone encouraged to apply here. So a couple different ways for you to get in touch with the Atlanta and North Georgia Building Trades Council. You can call them 404-584-0005. That's 404-584-0005. Or you can check them out online at angbtc.org. That's angbtc.org. That'll get you in touch with the Atlanta and North Georgia Building Trades Council. So you mentioned Zachary Evans a moment ago, Jeff, and honestly, I was asked to ask you about him here today. I put a lot of social media chatter about this. I'm sure this is as simple as saying available player, available scholarship. People just sort of draw the line and connect the dots there with that. I know there's also been a lot of smoke about Evans. He was off the field for his high school team a bit this year. It seems like Georgia was hot and heavy with him at one point in time, and then that kind of cooled off after a while. I guess a simple question here is Georgia still recruiting Zachary Evans, do we think? Even if we can't predict what Evans is going to do, is Georgia holding on to a scholarship spot that it would gladly give to Evans? What's your best guess on that?
I don't think that's the case, what you just said there. I don't think they're holding on to a scholarship spot for Evans. Okay, simple stuff here. It seems like we try to make things all crazy with the guys and their soap opera arcs here. There was a point when Zachary Evans was going to be in the class at the University of Georgia. He was going to be a good fit. He was going to be the second back in the class. Georgia had looked for guys. This is July type stuff here that Georgia felt good about having Zachary Evans in the class. And there was a reason why Zachary Evans was not being recruited as heavily by the University of Georgia. Georgia looked elsewhere. Georgia kind of felt, in my opinion here, that they were good with Kendall Milton as the only one back in the class. The remaining names, Brandon, if you look how the way things closed for Georgia, the remaining names, there are priorities at other positions. There's a priority at tight end. There's a priority at corner. There's a priority, 2 priorities on the offensive line. You've got to think who becomes the last 1 or 2 pieces of the class. I think a lot of that's going to look toward the month of January where folks can figure out who's moving on, where's the depth needed, is there any transfer portal guys, is there any early attrition, is there guys that decided to jump to the NFL that was maybe unexpected. I think that will determine what the rest of Georgia's board looks like. In terms of also maybe the additional recruiting for the 2020 season, which might be going to go get a graduate transfer for some spots on the roster. I mean, Evans is a fantastic player, but there are some things that have happened that didn't make him such a good fit for the good fit for the class. I think Kirby Smart said something in his comments everybody always pulls nuggets out from. He wants to make sure he finds high-quality people, state championship level type players, people that fit the Georgia profile when they go out of state looking for the right characters for the program. Zachary Evans, it will be very interesting to see, but reminder, folks, he hasn't visited Georgia since at least July. And that will be very interesting to see whether he goes anywhere beyond Oklahoma, Texas A&M, or Oklahoma. I think folks that want to tout the Zachary Evans thoughts, you also have to remember that Oklahoma lost a back that had been committed to their program for 2 years since 2017 when Jace McClellan flipped to Alabama on early signing day. That's another school that I think is not being talked up enough when it comes to Zachary Evans as well.
Another name that's kind of still out there for the February chase is Avante Williams, a safety that we at one point in time talked about. Seemed like he was content to go other places, and yet lo and behold, he's kind of still out there on the board. We have talked about Georgia being involved with multiple safeties as of late. Is Williams a guy that Georgia might circle back on, or is Georgia a school that Williams might attempt to circle back on?
Yeah, Brandon, that's another name that got some dust on it as he blow kind of cobwebs off that name. To me, the way I look at that situation in safety is Avante Williams, is he a safety? Yes, he is. He was a guy whose recruiting timeline didn't really fit when Georgia was looking at it heavily over the summer. They were looking to kind of make a decision right there with somewhere at that safety position over the summer. But frankly, Brandon, Georgia needed another safety. I thought the ability for them to bring another safety type into the class would have been Eric Reed. I think they fulfilled that need with Major Burns in terms of getting a true safety type in the class. Eric Reed had played corner for his high school team. He came down to Georgia and Auburn. Eric Reed ended up choosing Auburn right there. So I think if Georgia would have made the strongest possible push there for Eric Reed because they needed another safety, the fact that they didn't try to bring Eric Reed Jr. in the class, and he's not a Bulldog right now, signed and delivered, makes me think that safety, especially the type of safety that Avante Williams would be, is probably not an ideal fit for that best player available down the line.
So we'll wrap up with this. This will be the last time you and I talk for at least a week. You're heading towards All-Star games. I've got a vacation coming up next week. Early signing period does conclude today. You've shared some thoughts on this already, but I guess kind of give me a final thought here on how you think the start of the 2020 class has gone for Georgia, and in addition to like the Jones, Van Pran stuff, kind of where you think that Georgia's still slated to go as the rest of this kind of plays out.
Yeah, so I think one of the things to think is I don't think Georgia could have asked, could have waved a magic wand over their wide receiver board in 2020 and done much, much better than they did, especially over the last 2 months of the recruiting cycle, and adding a Jermaine Burton and adding a Arian Smith and making sure that Marcus Rosemy and Justin Robinson were still Bulldogs. I think it's not a hard projection, Brandon, to look at Georgia's wide receiver room and think that when Pickens and Blaylock are juniors, and then this group of guys that came in are sophomores, to think, and it doesn't really strain the mind to think this, Brandon. I think Georgia could have the best wide receiving room in the SEC by the 2021 season. They could have the best group of receivers in the Southeastern Conference by the 2021 season. I think it's really stark. I had to say it twice coming out of my mouth to make sure I felt that way about it. It sounded right, but I think if a lot of those names hit like I think they can, I think Burton and I think Rosemy can provide the type of impact in season one that Pickens and Blaylock did this year for Georgia. Those flashes of play and those I guess that gulf of hope when those young men get out on the field, and you think, if that young man gets the ball in his hands, he's very likely to make a play that's going to do something good for Georgia. I think clearly Burton and Rosemy have those abilities. I think Justin Robinson has those abilities. And I think Arian Smith will stretch out defenses, period, no matter how many balls he catches or not, and it will keep teams from playing man coverage against Georgia. And Georgia now has the dudes to go out and beat man coverage. I think a close, maybe one of those mints that you have on your plate after a fine meal at your favorite steakhouse, I think a potential mint to the end of the Georgia class might be the fact that they look inward for a couple of players. You saw the name DJ Lundy, he's two-time state champion. He's a wrestler out of Wasilla. He has decided to hit the brakes on his recruiting and wait till the traditional signing day, the February signing day, to choose between his schools. Georgia has offered him as an inside linebacker. Some of the coaches and the scouts that I've talked to across the state about DJ Lundy, reminder, a two-time state champion, has been a running back, has been an athlete all over the side of the ball for Irwin County. They look at him as a more athletic Tate Crowder type should he choose Georgia. this might be a case even when you lump in the name Austin Lasky as two guys that were Georgia-bred prospects going to play for the state of Georgia. And even though they might even be in the class because other guys said no or looked elsewhere, I think both of those young men have the ability to be players for the state of Georgia. And for a lot of those that sometimes feel that if all things are equal, take the kid that grew up with a Georgia G cap in their truck, or that has a Georgia G jersey in their closet, or their parents are all Bulldogs and all families full of Bulldogs. I think if all things being equal, I know a lot of our readers and viewers would like to see Georgia turn to those players as well. I think those are things to think about with the end of the class and the best players available. I think inside linebacker is another position that they'll try to address because they tried doing that with a late offer to Kobe Wilson as well. Kobe Wilson told me it was very intriguing, and maybe on Tuesday night before early signing day on Wednesday, Kobe Wilson told me that he was leaning towards Georgia. But in the end, he just got the feeling that he had a better chance to go play right away, perhaps be a freshman All-American at Temple, rather than be a depth piece there for Georgia to look at as well. So I think, those are the things when everybody starts to wonder how these things finish. I think the way you kind of still have to size it up is those birds in the hand, and we're going to call those commitments right now, Von Tron and Roderick Jones, need to stay in the hand. And then if Georgia can finish with some of the other bigger names like Keely Ringo and Darnell Washington, I think anything else after those four names in this class would simply just be gravy.
All right, Jeff, good stuff. Thanks for being here on DawgNation Daily presented by Kroger. Hope you enjoy your week to come. Merry Christmas, happy holidays to you and your family. And, of course, we will enjoy the chance to speak to you again soon.
Hey, guys, happy holidays. Merry Christmas to everybody. And, hey, Brandon, Merry Christmas to you and all Team Adams as well.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
Yep.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Obviously, we're going to go cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean here in a moment. Let me do a couple things off what Jeff said, though. Jeff mentioned, hey, you may have a couple guys in this 2020 class who weren't necessarily first-choice targets that end up in Georgia's class because of something that happened with a different player. Let me remind you something here real quick. How did Ed Orgeron end up as LSU coach? He ended up as LSU coach because a couple other guys decided they didn't want that job, or they decided that something else was a better fit for them. You think LSU fans would go do a do-over on that to get Tom Herman as coach, to get Jimbo Fisher as coach? Absolutely not. Sometimes things have a way of working out exactly the way they're supposed to. Orgeron exactly where he's supposed to be in Baton Rouge. Not the first choice, but proved to be the best choice. And when it comes to recruiting, you can see the same thing from time to time. And I know that, listen, I've even been told this. I had a father, one of the Georgia players, pull me to a side at one of the game and said, hey, enjoy listening to the show, but you fixate too much on star rankings when it comes to these players. That's not always the best way to measure the fight inside of a player, and I totally respect that, and I totally get that. We may be about to see that. I mean, after all, when you look at the success of the Georgia defense this year, who were some of the best contributors to that Georgia defense? A lot of the guys who did the best work for Georgia this year did not happen to be the high 4-star, the 5-star player. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to completely stop fixating on 4- and 5-star names around here, but there is a point to be made sometimes that things have a way of working out like they're supposed to, and sometimes that star rating doesn't always measure the fight inside of a player. And so we may see that with a couple of guys either in the class already or sort of still yet to come when it comes to Georgia. With that said, now, a couple of the 5-star names that Jeff just mentioned, I'm not going to try to get my own hopes up about anything like that, nor am I going to falsely try to get your hopes about a 5-star name that's still out there. Now, Ringo and Washington are obviously reasonable picks for Georgia right now. We've essentially been doing that for months and months and months. Birch, who's committed to South Carolina but has not yet signed. Zachary Evans, who there seems to be a lot of online chatter about right now and yet has not really been connected to Georgia all that much as of late. I am not going to falsely fan the flames of excitement over either of those guys. But what's the old Dumb and Dumber line? So you're saying there's a chance? As long as the door is open a sliver, I'm at least going to keep my eye on it, right? My grandfather used to always tell me that he kept a candle in the window for me. Anytime I wanted to come over and see him, there'd always be a candle in the window. My guess is there may be a candle in the window for the Dogs here just in case a Birch or an Evans or one of these surprise additions wants to think about something, although ultimately the conventional wisdom is most likely to prevail, but it's at least worth mentioning there. And then one more thing, and then I promise we'll go cruise around the SEC. Jeff talking about the way in which Georgia's added four-star wide receivers this year to go along with the Blaylocks and the Pickens of a year ago. To think that one day Georgia may have a wide receiving core that's one of the tops in the SEC, one of the strengths of the Georgia roster, I think it speaks to the recruiting work behind the scenes that Georgia's doing. And frankly, it's an argument in favor of the status quo and continuity when it comes to the Georgia coaching staff. Not just James Coley, but a guy like Cortez Hankton, who's getting praise for the work with Marcus Roseme. A guy like Scott Fountain, who as an area recruiter is getting praise for his work with Arian Smith. This Georgia coaching staff knew that it had a need at wide receiver, and it went out and met it. And so when we're talking about, as we did earlier in the show, of will there be offensive changes to come? Will coaching changes be the catalyst for better and improved offensive play in 2020? It's important to note that Georgia saw a need at receiver, and the coaching staff's the coaches currently employed on this staff are the ones who went out there and did some big-time work to fix that. So file that away and do with that what you will. Cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And, this year Royal Caribbean turns 50 years bold. And one of the ways they show that boldness is by setting the standard with truly dazzling entertainment at sea. I'm talking about full-scale productions every night on every cruise, and it's all included in your fare. They're the only cruise line offering awe-inspiring Tony Award-winning Broadway musicals, ice skating shows, diving shows, performing drones, original productions. I'm talking about Hairspray, Grease, Mamma Mia, Cats. That's just some of the Broadway musicals on display there on Royal Caribbean ships. And, of course, Aqua Theater shows with, like, the high jumps. If you're watching a video, you see that right now. That's available on the Oasis-class ships. This is like an amazing, amazing entertainment experience. In fact, it was Travel Weekly Reader's Choice Awards for the best entertainment at sea. So you want to make sure that you book your vacation now to take advantage of all of this. And you can either contact your own travel professional or let me recommend the Cruise and Vacation Authority. Now, the number to get in touch with them, it's 800-326-4971. Once again, 800-326-4971. That'll get you in touch with the Cruise and Vacation Authority. Do me a favor. Let them know you heard about them on DawgNation Daily. I really appreciate that. And obviously, given the fact this is our last show for the week to come, that means we won't get a chance to talk about the college football playoff matchups. So let me do a little bit of that right now. And I know I'm kind of running late on my music. I ended up talking too much about what Jeff had to say. But let me start with LSU and Oklahoma. I haven't really made official picks on this, but I'm like a lot of you. I was so impressed with what I saw from LSU in the SEC championship that I might take them to win the entire thing, right? Burrow is just amazing, better than I even realized. LSU's offense is just at a different level, obviously also dealing with the status situation when it comes to the running back, Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Oklahoma's also got a couple of suspensions. They're going to be big factors here too. Let me only make this one point. LSU very well might win the national championship, but I actually think 14 points, which the spread is for the game against Oklahoma, going to be played right here in Atlanta. I think that's too much. I think that LSU faces a lot of teams in the SEC, good teams, by the way, but teams that don't necessarily want to get into the same kind of game that LSU does. The Auburn game, even the Florida game, the Georgia game, certainly. Those are wins that LSU collects, but other than Alabama, most of those teams are kind of trying to do the thing a different kind of way. Oklahoma, though, will be very comfortable with that LSU style, and Oklahoma's been playing that way for a long time. So this may be one of those games where, because both teams want to kind of fly up and down the field, we may see a lot of points, and it may play into Oklahoma's hand a bit. I don't see Oklahoma winning this game, upsetting LSU, but I do see the potential of this game being a little closer than the experts think, so keep that in mind. One more cruising around the SEC story. Coming outside the SEC, a preview of the Fiesta Bowl between Clemson and Ohio State. I think the one real big takeaway here is the winner of this game, whichever team it is at a huge disadvantage in comparison to LSU right now. And to the victor goes the spoils. You ought to get something for being the number one overall seed. What LSU gets, and because ultimately I think LSU wins that game, is they get a chance to play a less physical Oklahoma team. They'll be less beaten up and bruised up. Oklahoma's not as good as the other three teams, even if they are somewhat offensively capable of keeping the game against the Tigers close. However, Ohio State-Clemson should be a knockdown dragout, a very tough game to win. And the one thing that I'm going to keep coming back to, even though Ohio State has validated itself this season over and over again, far more than Clemson can ever hope to, Ohio State's actually beaten, especially in the second half of the year, a pretty good collection of teams, all things being equal. Ohio State has nothing to apologize for when it comes to its resume. Clemson's played a schedule weaker than water. We all know that. But as I've also said, that just because they're playing a weak schedule doesn't mean this isn't still an elite program and still isn't a great team. I think that Clemson probably is a great team that has had the advantage of playing a weak schedule. And one way or another, don't assume that the soft schedule makes Clemson a soft team. Clemson's actually my pick to beat Ohio State, even though Ohio State's been arguably the most dominant team in college football this season compared to the teams that it's playing. I think that Clemson's still a tough team to deal with. Trevor Lawrence has more experience in this spot than what Justin Fields brings to the table. I think by a slight margin, they're only about a 2-point favor. That seems about right, winning by about a field goal. I'll take Clemson here over the Ohio State Buckeyes. I know we've seen blowouts in semifinals games in recent years. I actually think there is potential that both these games could be really, really entertaining. We'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of our friends at Royal Caribbean. And here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger, I want to play request for you. Somebody reached out to me on Twitter. It's our buddy Santiago D. Arn who reached out to us on Twitter to say, hey, B.A., was it Jermaine Burton who jumped over the swimming pool that y'all were talking about back during the spring out in Calabasas, California, where he lives? And yes, that's indeed the case. And this is sort of apropos of nothing other than we were kind of asked to do it. But it is amazing the kind of athleticism that Georgia's getting in its receiver room. Arian Smith, the world-class sprinter. I know if you're listening radio podcast, you can't see this, but Jermaine Burton is jumping over the full length of a swimming pool. Now, it's a little smaller swimming pool than maybe the one that you have in your neighborhood or your backyard, but I'm not going to shortchange this. This is an impressive, amazing performance. Really not a very long running start to jump over this thing. That is good athleticism. Now, that's also dangerous, and I have to be a dad here and say, be careful, young man. But a pretty impressive performance for a receiver that I think is going to make certainly the Georgia receiving core a lot more fun to watch. He and Smith and Roseme and Justin Robinson we had a chance to speak to this week. Love the idea of adding all four of those big names to the Dogs. That is really good stuff all the way around. Let's also get ready to do our Kroger kickoff, not just kicking off the weekend, but really for many of us kicking off the holiday season. However, don't forget, even though as we're doing all the Yuletide fun stuff, still pretty busy when it comes to UGA athletics all the way around. So let's talk about some of that right now with our Kroger kickoff. Early signing period for Georgia does conclude today. Georgia's not expected to sign anyone today. You kind of heard Jeff Santel putting the full lid on that, at least for right now. Lundy and some of these other names, we'll wait and hear about them as we head towards February. Of course, the January announcements for Ringo and Washington, but officially the early signing period does end today. Men's basketball tonight against SMU. Georgia needs to play well at home after getting just absolutely demolished last weekend by Arizona State out there in Tempe. Bobby Hurley's team. So men's basketball tonight against SMU, Lady Dogs against Gardner-Webb on Sunday, and then the 23rd, Georgia's done a holiday game like this for a little bit of a while here. They're back at it in Stegman Coliseum again against Georgia Southern. That comes up on Monday. So this weekend, even though we're heading towards Christmas, pretty busy stuff, all things considered, going on with UGA Athletics. And with that in mind, we'll get ready to wrap things up. And as we do, I'll remind you that our Kroger Kickoff is brought to you by our friends at Kroger, and you're getting ready for holiday get-togethers this time of year, heading towards Christmas Eve. You know, that's a big day for so many of you in that regard. Kroger Party Platter is a great way to make sure you get everybody fed, good food, great way to get people together. They start at just $19.99. So I'm talking about shrimp platters, meat and cheese trays, veggie trays, a lot of different options for you. And at Kroger, they begin at just $19.99. So stop in and say hello to the folks at the Kroger close to you, and they will take really good care of you. So as I said before, this is our final show for the week. Next week, we're on vacation, enjoying some Christmas time with our family and friends. I hope all of you get a chance to enjoy your holiday season as well. It seems appropriate to say a big thank you to all of you for making so much of this so possible for us each and every day. Narrating the experience of being a Georgia fan is something I'm incredibly grateful for so many of you. And I'm also proud to say, Gator Hater Updater, 1,147 days. That's a pretty good Christmas present for us all. We'll see you a week from now, right back here on DawgNation Daily. And on video. Time now for our R.S. Andrews cool down. We will get ready to roll into that. Connor, before you get going, would you mind doing me a favor? I forgot to put Eddie on the desk. Would you mind just handing me him? Every now and then we take Eddie off the desk, and sometimes I forget. So it seems wrong on this Christmas day to kind of keep him tucked away on the shelf. Let's give him some prominence, some chance to have some FaceTime here on camera before we sign off and wrap up for the Christmas season. We have got to be pretty quick today. We have got more stuff we've got to do, but let's try to knock out 10, 15 minutes of really good, strong comments here for a couple of minutes. Give you a chance to weigh in on anything you want to. We'll try to keep it light and fun. So let's do that on both Facebook and YouTube. And I'll try the YouTube side first here today. Brian McPhail says, does Bama have any more spots left? They have 26 commits right now. So the whole thing about how many people you can sign has always been confusing to me. So the answer is I have no idea. That's a great question. I have no idea. Taiwan Taylor not exactly doing his part to keep it light and fun, but nonetheless, we appreciate everybody being a part of our comment section here today. K9 Blues on subject of Arian Smith saying he's going to be dynamic in the return game. I think he might start before all the other wide receivers we signed. Because of that speed, he definitely brings a lot to the table. That's a fun thing to think about. Arian Smith and that speed. It's going to be a lot of fun. By the way, Cassie Belleville, not too early to start thinking about this. Cassie's right. Georgia in Tuscaloosa in September. You better believe starting January, when we kind of start thinking heavily about that 2020 season, my guess is that trip to Tuscaloosa is going to come up on this show 1 or 2 times, I'm guessing.
I'm just going to get out in front of this. Kirby Smart cannot afford to lose that game. Given what has happened with LSU this year, given what has happened with Alabama the last 2 times he played them, that game is going to be.
I think it's huge. I think it's huge for both sides.
Yeah.
It's a big game for both sides. But for Kirby Smart, as I said before, right now he's got like huge popularity. Sometimes, and I'll make a cumbersome analogy here, and I won't belabor it too much. In politics, popularity and favorability are not the same thing. Mm-hmm. Favorability about the job you're doing can kind of go up and down. Popularity in terms of would you rather have this person or that person, that has a tendency not to wane quite as much. So Kirby right now does not have very high favorability, but very high popularity. Mm-hmm. People would say this past season Georgia's coaches could have done a better job, but right now, by and large, by a huge margin, Georgia fans still want and believe that Kirby Smart and his staff are the right people for that. Some of that popularity will dip a little bit if Georgia doesn't beat Alabama in September.
Is that game more important to Saban or Smart?
I believe it's more important to Saban because I think he's closer to the end, and it's a lot easier for that narrative to form around him. If, look, Saban's playing in a like run of the mill, New Year's. He's not in the New Year's Six right now. So Alabama fans will tolerate this for the moment, but if that's followed up with a September loss, Alabama hasn't lost in September, I don't think, since 2015. If it's a September loss to go along with being in the Citrus Bowl, I actually do think that's a little harder for Nick Saban to overcome.
Fair enough. Green Soldier asked BAA, who do you think UGA gets as a grad transfer if Fromm leaves?
I think that the best chance of all, and this is me being a wet blanket I don't want to be, the best chance of all is a name that we haven't considered yet, and quite possibly a name I actually don't really know all that well. This is one of those where, as exciting as KJ Costello would be, for different reasons, as exciting as Derrick King would be, the field bet is still the most. And I don't mean Fields. I mean, let me be very careful about this. The field, meaning every other potential name, the field bet is still a heavy favorite. I mean, it could be a 2020 version of what Alex Hornerbrook was leaving Wisconsin to go to Florida State or anything like that. And I realize that's not anywhere near as exciting. But the one thing, and this is not me trying to be a grifter, I'm being very honest. Don't be so quick to assume that a guy that put up meager stats for a worse team is going to come to Georgia and be the similar kind of player. I think you can see quarterbacks play much better when surrounded by better talent. So even if the guy that Georgia, assuming that Fromm were to leave, even if the guy that Georgia were to bring in is the kind of guy that wasn't exactly the sexiest name out there, I think there's still a possibility that guy plays far better at Georgia than another place. Just as a simple, for instance, Grayson Lambert, you can say what you want about him, but he was a way better quarterback at Georgia than he had been the previous year at Virginia. So just kind of keep that in mind.
To actually answer the question.
I did answer the question.
One, an example of a guy putting up better numbers with better talent around him. No one knew who Gardner Minshew was
That's a great
this
example.
time 3 years ago. Then he led the NCAA in passing at Washington State and is now looking like a pretty solid NFL starting quarterback. If you were allowed to speak George Pickens into existence last year, which you certainly were, and damn whatever reporting and stuff was out there, you said you were going to keep asking and keep talking about Pickens until it was over. The name that I believe, if Fromm goes pro, Georgia absolutely needs to land, needs to get, is KJ Costello.
Yeah. I think the problem with me trying to pull a George Pickens speaking into existence is there was at least enough of a sliver there that it didn't seem unfair to the audience to talk about it, if that makes sense. I need somebody to say something semi on the record. I need there to be at least a little bit of online chatter. I need it to be something other than, oh, this guy wants to transfer, this team potentially needs a quarterback. But the moment there's something, the moment there's some guy in California saying, I wouldn't be surprised to see him end up at Georgia, the moment anything like that comes, you better believe Costello will be my guy, because I think a quarterback like that who's proven to be a smart guy and in certain situations proven to be a good quarterback, I think a guy like that throwing to Georgia's receivers, the ones they're going to have next year, playing behind Georgia's offensive line, even minus Thomas and Wilson, you better believe that has a chance to be a very, very special situation.
Couple things here on Costello. Taiwan Taylor mentions he got hurt a lot. Everyone on Stanford got hurt a lot this year. They lost about 6 or 7 different starting offensive linemen for the season, and that's part of the reason why I think you've seen close to now 13 players from Stanford enter the transfer portal. Something is very much going on there out there in Palo Alto, and not in a good way, more like in a, I'm not going to make a reference there. But on Costello, when he was healthy in the 2018 season, 29 touchdowns, 11 interceptions, 65 completion percentage, and that was with Bryce Love being hurt for pretty much the entire season. They got almost next to nothing from their running game in that game. You put him in a UGA offense, which, you could certainly have questions about after this season. As someone who's watched a lot of Stanford football over the seasons, that Stanford offense is worlds worse than Georgia. And so you bring him in here, you get to put him around a real running game in White, White, James Cook, Kendall Milton, a good but not potentially great offensive line. I think you could see him do very good things for Georgia next year if Georgia is able to land Costello, not assuming Fromm leaves. If Fromm leaves, Costello would be the best backup option I think they could get their hands on.
Jacoby Montreal Wilson on Facebook asked a good question, and I think there's a very important answer to this question. He says, why isn't Georgia in the mix for the top dual-threat quarterbacks? Here's what I firmly believe to be true. I believe that Georgia is in the mix for a lot of these guys. I believe that Georgia would be, at least I have to assume, would be potentially interested in a guy like Derek King, even though we just talked a lot about Costello. They're obviously going all in, trying to win with Caleb Williams for the class of 2021. And then for, other quarterbacks, other classes, I think it's very much the same way. I think that Georgia is trying to recruit these guys. I think that Georgia, wanted to keep Justin Fields. Georgia wants to be in on the top dual-threat quarterbacks. Right now, though, those guys are just choosing to go other places. So, we'll see what happens with Williams for the 2021 class. If Georgia were to be in the market for a transfer quarterback, we'll see what King decides to do. But ultimately, I do think there's a thought out there, if you're a guy like a King, that you might be utilized better in another offense. Fairly or not, that may be the thing that's out there. But this, to me, and I think this is an important distinction, this is not because Georgia's not trying to recruit those guys. At least in one case, in Caleb Williams, they are going, to my knowledge, all in on trying to get him. But ultimately, you got to have two to tango here. He may just choose to go play somewhere else. So this is not Georgia saying we only want drop-back passers. We don't want the dual-threat quarterback. I think Georgia tries to keep a lot of irons in the fire. Frankly,
right.
I think they're trying to recruit both kinds of quarterbacks. It just so happens that, maybe the last couple of years on the recruiting trail, because I think of Mathis as more of a drop-back passer than a dual threat. It just so happens on the last couple of years they've just had more success with the one than the other. And obviously Fields made the decision to transfer, but that doesn't mean that Georgia's not recruiting dual threats anymore.
Right, and two things to keep in mind here. One, LSU is going to be an open and very attractive graduate transfer quarterback job there. I have no inside information here, but I kind of think that's where Derek King might end up there. Granted that LSU has a lot of strong ties to that Houston area, and I think they can appeal to him there. I'm seeing a lot of mentions of Chase Bryce. He has not yet entered the transfer portal. He is someone who I'm sure, given his ties to the state of Georgia, state championship winning quarterback at Grayson would draw some interest from people, whether or not Fromm chooses to leave or not. So he mentioned Joey Yellen. The issue with Yellen and potentially other guys is after last offseason, what we saw with the transfer portal, I know Martell and Fields were granted eligibility, but that was about it. So unless you were for sure a graduate transfer, I don't really see how Georgia, if Fromm leaves, can afford to take a risk on a guy. I'm bringing in a guy who might not be ruled eligible to play for you guys in 2020.
Yeah, that's a pretty good point. Let me see if we can find by the way, Matt Rugavina, who lives in Houston, says tons of LSU people there in Houston. Yeah, that's one of those big hotbeds for that. In fact, I saw this thing on Twitter the other day where somebody in Houston, as a part of a big lights display, had made an Ed Orgeron-themed Christmas lights display, which I thought was kind of funny. So that gives you an idea of just how much of a hotbed for LSU fandom the city of Houston is. Jay Squilla says Bama and LSU going to be tough to beat for King. Yeah, it's going to be a contested hot recruitment for sure. Big-time hot recruitment. Jacob O'Neill says, what's he talking about? Carson Beck. So, how do you feel about Carson Beck, Connor? What's your prognostication? You're feeling on Beck?
I don't he had a great end to his junior year, and there was a lot of hype, surrounding him in the offseason. It sort of seemed like, when he committed to Georgia, there was a potential that he could raise his ranking. And for whatever reason, he sort of didn't. He didn't exactly wow, I would say, at the opening out there in Dallas from all accounts there. And then, I think he'd probably admit that statistically he had an underwhelming senior season. I think the big thing with Beck to keep in mind is, I know Jake Fromm did it, but Jake Fromm wasn't exactly, playing like Joe Burrow out there. I think you look at someone like Bo Nix, who had a lot of up and downs this year. I think that's sort of the more traditional what you can get from a freshman quarterback. And if you're relying on that next year, I don't think that's a very successful recipe for Georgia in 2020.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I mean, I think if you're Georgia, being a national championship contender means something other than a true freshman starting quarterback. And I say that with all due respect to Beck. He may end up being a great one, but Connor's right. Fromm made it look easier than it is in 2017, and frankly, Trevor Lawrence made it look easier than it is last year. We've seen these freshman quarterbacks play really well, and I think we're all of a sudden now of the belief that it's easy for any of them to do it, and for most of them it's pretty hard. Nix himself is a pretty good prospect coming out of high school, and more often than not, he was only an average quarterback here this season, so that's something to keep in mind. My desire from Beck, though, is, and for the most part, I won't get to see this, but we may hear some whispers about it. My desire for Beck is, okay, being at practice this week, on campus now, presumably going through some of these practices, being on campus going into the spring, can you take on some leadership qualities that a quarterback's supposed to have? Because obviously from a skill set standpoint, he wouldn't be at Georgia if he didn't possess a lot of that. But I think one of the things that separates the guys who are good enough to start from the guys who are good enough to thrive is how much they take on the mantle of, I'm going to get in a 20-year-old's face, and I'm going to say, hey, I need you to do this. From, for whatever you want to say about, him on the field, and there have been a lot of great moments, maybe a couple times this year where there's something to be desired, you can go back and see evidence from his first spring on the Georgia campus. He was in guys' face, rah-rah, positive, but also just kind of being that leader, doing the things that a quarterback's supposed to do. I'm really, really eager to see some of that from Carson Beck. And I think it'd be great if he could step into that role without also having to face the pressure of being the starting quarterback for Georgia. And I'd say this about Mathis or any of them. Practice being a leader before it's your team to lead, and then when that opportunity does come, if it does come, you'll be better off for it. That's the thing I think it's great here. And, Justin had this a couple of years ago. Carson's going to get this right now. That chance to kind of go through these practices, be a part of all that, and just see what it looks like at the highest level, and then kind of step into that role eventually. I think it's really important.
Yeah, and there are a lot of people on YouTube who I kind of agree with this sentiment. I think Carson having a year to come in and develop and sort of get acclimated and adjusted to the college game. And, to Jeff's point he made on our show today, Georgia's going to have, assuming Dominic Blaylock is able to come back and be healthy, Georgia's probably going to have a really good wide receiver room in 2021. I think that's why maybe, whereas, Georgia's projected to only bring back about 54% of its receiving yards for next year. That's why, I think that's a big ask for a true freshman quarterback, but a guy who's got a year to learn and develop in the system. That's why there is, I think you do see a lot of excitement for Beck. I just don't necessarily know if that's best put towards the 2020 season.
James Crump makes an interesting comment. He's speaking to someone else, so I'm going to steal his line anyway. He says, what's most interesting to recruit or attractive to recruits is having a shot to win the national championship. Here's a really important thing to remember. I said this during the regular show. I want Fromm to stay. But if Fromm decides the NFL is where he needs to go to right now, if he leaves, Georgia's quarterback job, the starting quarterback at Georgia, no matter how much the offense was criticized this year, and no matter how much questions were asked about some of the supporting talent around the quarterback, and just lots of questions about a lot of things overall, the starting quarterback at Georgia will be a very coveted role.
Yes.
And I don't know if it's going to mean that the best names of all go out there and take it, because Georgia's not the only coveted role that's out there. But you better believe there's no blight on the Georgia starting quarterback job if Jake Fromm were to step away. So one thing is for sure. In 2020, when the calendar flips over to the new year and we kind of flip over in our minds to the new season, I don't care what Jake decides to do. I hope he comes back, but even if he doesn't, my expectation is that Georgia's in the thick of the competition, still a contender. Now, I know you'd say, well, I'm ready to see Georgia be more than a contender. I'm ready to see them win it. I can't promise you that one way or another. But with a fairly strong sense of certainty, I can tell you that in terms of being a contender next season, regardless of who's taking snaps under center, one way or another, Georgia will figure it out.
Right. To your point, if Fromm does leave, Georgia's going to be an attractive option given, their defense is still going to be really, really good next year. And if Richard LeCount and Eric Stokes both decide to stay, I think there's a really, really good chance this defense is somehow even better next year than it was this year. And, offensively, yes, they're young, but they are starting to bring in some skill players that, can stretch the field a little bit and make things more interesting vertically. So it's going, if Fromm does, in the event that Fromm does leave, and I partially agree with you, I think Georgia's best chance, just from a continuity sake and sort of the importance of that year over year, kind of like we saw with Joe Burrow this year, Fromm coming back probably is the best chance for Georgia to win there. But in the event that he should decide to go pursue a pro career, I think Georgia's going to, it might not be LSU, but it might be the number 2 most attractive quarterback job open this offseason.
Let me do Joel Moody's comment and Doug Rayburn's comment, and then after that we got to get ready to go. We may do one more after that. Joel asked about the tackles for the Sugar Bowl. So, Connor, you said something the other day, and I think it was on the air. The more I think about it, the more right I think it might be. That just given the absence of that next guard, you may have to play Salyer at a guard spot, which would open the door to have Cade Mays. And then, do we think that Truss is ahead of Condon right now?
Condon is not healthy. He's had his arm in a shoulder brace for a while. I think one thing to watch, maybe they put DeMarcus Hayes out there at left tackle. Would be his last game. A little send off there for him. Whereas, Truss, I think that's maybe more with a look towards the future there. You're going to interject something?
No, go ahead and finish.
So I think those are probably your most realistic options.
I was laughing at myself because this is going to sound like a snarky comment, but I mean it honestly. Do you think they could play Hayes or Truss at like that second tight end spot and have both Hayes and Truss in the game together on, like, say, the right side? I'm not trying to be a snarky. I'm honestly, because against a team that's been pretty good at rushing the passer, to have a tackle who hasn't played very much is a pretty tall order. And a lot of times that sixth offensive lineman, and Georgia played that, a decent amount from time to time. Mays was that guy a lot. He's obviously going to be, my assumption is, occupying a starting spot. I wonder if they use that sixth tackle more here, just because you're going to have to chip somebody for Baylor, because they're coming after Fromm.
Baylor had 43 sacks
That's a
this
lot
season.
of sacks.
I know there's the jokes about Big 12 defenses. Baylor is a legitimately good defense.
Yeah.
And Georgia, I think even with Thomas and Wilson, it wasn't exactly going to be, a walk in the park. And now, without those two guys, who very well could have been, I think maybe the first and third best tackles in the SEC this year, you don't just replace those guys like that.
Yeah.
And it's, nothing lost. And again, we don't know who's coaching them in this game. Sam Pittman's almost assuredly not there. Matt Luke probably isn't going to be there. So you have to wonder, who's going to be the one making these sort of adjustments that need to be made over the course of a game.
But in the Gator Bowl a couple years ago, Georgia had like 3 coaches. It was almost like an AAU basketball game where you just had like some dads out there kind of assisting and helping out. So for one game, you can probably kind of figure that out. But the more I think about it, the more I think that Salyer probably, even though he's a part of the tackle competition, I think for this game, he just may be more needed at the guard spot. And one of these guys, like a DeMarcus Hayes or a Xavier Truss, maybe the guy who gets the nod at tackle, but you may have to give one of those guys some help. And Georgia's tight end's not particularly big, so in terms of giving them the help that you need, you may have to play that sixth lineman a little bit more. Somebody mentioned Dominic Blaylock. If I could wave a magic wand for anything right now, I believe I might waste it and use it on give me this young man getting a good health report as soon as possible. Connor, you've obviously written about Blaylock a lot. I know, what you thought of his freshman season, but I think we've all grown to just really, really like Dom, and obviously most of us liked him a lot even back when he was in high school. Is it too much to say, Santa Claus, deliver me some good health for Dominic Blaylock? That may be my Christmas present I want more than anything.
And I've been as vocal a proponent as Blaylock as anyone. I thought, granted he went out early in the game, but I think he showed, he's one of the few guys this year for Georgia that was able to get open and make some things happen. And, the worry with him, it isn't just, coming back from an ACL injury. It's, his game was not necessarily, built on athleticism already. And so if he, potentially loses half a step because of this injury, that does make me, cause for concern for maybe his long-term future. But if you can tell me that he's going to come back and be all right and be okay and be ready to go come July, which is roughly around when the timeline is and when he's expected to be good to go, I think that's going to be very important for Georgia because, the thing with the way their schedule sets up next year, they're playing Alabama the third game of the regular season. And I don't know how much you can expect from Burton and how much you can expect from those young guys, especially Smith and Rosemead, given that they're coming in June. And, we didn't really see Pickens start to emerge until later on after the Notre Dame game. So, at least against, Power 5 competition, obviously. So, that to me, if Fromm right now is 1A storyline, I think one of the biggest spring storylines is how healthy is Dominic Blaylock and where is he in terms of coming back?
Henry Rockamore brings up a really good point. You think Notori Johnson regrets moving to defensive line now? Because, listen, he's actually played – I've always been of the belief that transitioning from offensive to defensive line is more difficult to do because of the quickness required for defensive linemen. To me, to my eyes, he's worked really well to get himself in tremendous shape. I think he's a little slimmer than he was when he came on the Georgia campus. He's worked really hard. He's played some along the defensive line. If he stays put, is he in a better position going into 2020 to get more playing time, just given the fact that Georgia may be on the verge of a good bit of attrition along the offensive line? I'm not making fun or making light. I'm honestly curious. Should Notori consider a position switch back to offensive line?
I don't know about switching back at this point in time. That's a little tough. But with Notori, I think there's a very real scenario where next year, I think you have Mays and Sawyer at your two tackle spots, and you have Justin Schaefer in there at right guard, and Solomon Kinley at left guard, or depending on what happens with Ben Cleveland. I do believe he told Jake Rowe at 247 that he was coming back next year. So
who is this now?
Ben Cleveland.
Yeah.
So I think it really, for Notori possibly playing, it depends on what happens with Kinley and Cleveland. But yes, but then there's also the fact Georgia's losing a bunch of defensive linemen next year, and he should potentially move up on the depth chart there.
I will say this. On senior day, is it next year? Am I right about this?
Yes.
Yeah, senior day next year, there's no cheering in the press box. I may step out of the press box for that because there are a couple guys who will be seniors next year that I want to give an ovation to. And Notori is going to be one of those guys because it is not easy to play at Georgia right now. No. And he has fought and done everything he possibly can to be on that field for UGA. So whether it's sticking out at defensive line and getting a shot next year, or potentially, I'm obviously just openly speculating that he might consider switching back one way or another. There was an opportunity for a lot of these guys to tuck tail and run, and guys like Notori have not done that. They have stayed here and fought. I would be honored to applaud him on senior day next year, and Georgia fans may get a chance to do a lot more applauding before you get to that last season there as well, or last game of the season there as well. Jay Squilla says don't sleep on Truss for next season. That's probably a pretty good thing to keep in mind there, too, and maybe a potential dress rehearsal for him coming up in New Orleans. All right, so let me say this. Huge thanks to all of you for being here with us today for DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger, and really for this entire year. We can't control the outcomes of games, nor can we control the outcome of recruiting decisions. All we can do is come in here and try to put our best foot forward to present the information for you in a fun and compelling way, and we try our best to do that each and every day. I am so grateful for that opportunity to be a part of that with all of you. I really, really appreciate that. And I hope that all of you have a wonderful holiday season, Christmas season, whatever you celebrate. Hopefully you're celebrating something, and hopefully you're doing it with family and friends. And we're just really, really grateful for this chance. I'm also grateful for all the people that help me do DawgNation Daily every single day. Connor Riley, who's here today, Michael Carvel, who you hear me talking about, Mike Griffith and Jeff Sintel and John Stinchcomb, our regular cast of guests that show up and be a part of the program each and every week. We are just really, really lucky to have so many resources at our disposal. Our buddy BJ, who kind of helps keep the train on the tracks. We're just so, so grateful for so much of that and really appreciate that. A couple more things on the way out the door here. If you want to make the upcoming bowl season, we got a game today. It's a Bahamas Bowl. Charlotte and whom? Buffalo. Listen. You want to make Charlotte Buffalo worth watching? Get yourself a little action on one side or the other. So my friends at MyBookie can provide. Use the promo code DawgNation. Get your first deposit doubled. You can get up to $1,000 Find MyBookie online. Use the promo code DawgNation. You play, you win, you get paid after that. Also, check out the AJC, Atlanta News Now, AJC.com. A lot of holiday stuff going on this time of year, festivals and events and just kind of cool things around the Atlanta area. You can check out all of that and stay up to date on all of it when you check out AJC.com. And serious news going on there as well. The AJC is all over that, both in our state and around our world. It's AJC.com for your Atlanta News Now. And huge thanks to Dari and the whole team over there at R.S. Andrews for making the R.S. Andrews cool down possible. Now, by the way, today we got R.S. Andrews Go With The Flow. That's noon today on the DawgNation video channels. Is that correct? We're going to do it next Friday. Okay, so we'll do that next Friday on the DawgNation video channels, but we do have one in the can. Pretty good edition of our Go With The Flow, making our picks for bowl season. We'll do that next Friday on all of that. And like I said before, just really appreciate all of you being with us. Huge thanks to R.S. Andrews for making it possible. Find him online at rsandrews.com. Y'all have a Merry Christmas, happy holiday season. I won't see you next week, but the following week, kicking off Monday, getting ready to go to New Orleans for the Sugar Bowl, and then a busy 2020 for us. Big things on the horizon for DawgNation in the new year, and I can't wait to tell you all about them. Y'all have a great week. Happy holidays. Merry Christmas. We'll look forward to talking to you again soon.